There is a detail in the 9th book of Herodotus, buried in a single paragraph between accounts of military campaigns and diplomatic negotiations, written with the specific, matter-of-fact brevity of a man describing something he wants his reader to absorb without the buffer of rhetorical elaboration, that describes a Persian queen in the final years of her life, ordering the burial of 14 living children of the most prominent noble families in the empire, pressing them into the earth as a sacrifice to the god of the underworld. And what makes this detail so historically extraordinary is not merely what it describes, but what surrounds it in the text. Because Herodotus, who documented mutilations and executions and mass killings throughout his histories without obvious moral distress, frames this single act with a quality of unease that tells you he understood, even as he wrote it down, that he was recording something that sat outside the normal categories of ancient violence. Amestris, whose name in Old Persian meant strong woman, a translation that turns out to be one of the most accurate etymologies in the entire ancient record, was not born into the Persian royal family, but married into it as the wife of the crown prince, who would become Xerxes I, the king who whipped the Hellespont and invaded Greece and built the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. And from the moment she entered the Achaemenid court, she demonstrated with consistent and increasingly extreme clarity that she understood something about the exercise of power that her husband, for all his military ambition, never quite grasped. That the most durable form of authority is not the kind that conquers territory, but the kind that makes every person in proximity to it permanently uncertain about exactly what it is capable of. The Persian royal court that Amestris navigated for over 60 years was one of the most dangerous political environments in the ancient world, a system built on the principle of absolute royal authority, in which the distance between the highest favour and the most extreme punishment could be crossed in a single afternoon, where the king's wives and concubines and their respective families were locked in permanent competition for influence and succession, where the children of secondary wives represented constant threats to the children of the primary queen, and where the only women who survived and thrived across multiple reigns were the ones who understood that in this specific environment, the appearance of submission and the reality of power were not contradictions, but complements. And Amestris, by every measure the ancient sources provide, was the most accomplished practitioner of this specific political art in the entire history of the Achaemenid dynasty. Stop here, because before we get to the buried children, before we reach the act that Herodotus could not quite write about without flinching, you need to understand something about what Amestris had already done by the time she ordered those 14 children into the ground, because this was not her first act of extreme violence, and it was not her second. It was the culmination of a career of power that had included ordering the mutilation of a woman's breasts, nose, ears, lips and tongue removed while she was still alive, arranging the execution of her own brother-in-law, breaking the sworn oath of one of Persia's most powerful military commanders, and outlasting every enemy, every rival queen, every ambitious noble who had ever looked at her position and calculated that it might be vulnerable. The specific mechanism by which Amestris ordered the mutilation of my sister's wife, a woman who had done nothing to her personally, but whose daughter had caught Xerxes' attention, reveals the specific sophistication of how she exercised power. Because she did not order the mutilation directly, she waited for Xerxes' birthday, the one day in the Persian royal calendar when the king was obligated by tradition to grant any request made by a member of his court, and she used that ceremonial obligation to ask for something that Xerxes could not refuse without breaking a custom so ancient and so publicly observed that its violation would have undermined his own authority, which means Amestris turned the king's own tradition against him, used the most formal and public moment in the royal calendar to accomplish something she could not have achieved through a private order, and did it so elegantly that Xerxes had no recourse except to comply. Here's the detail that most histories of Amestris skip over entirely and pay attention, because it changes the entire moral calculation of what she did. Herodotus records that Xerxes himself, when confronted with Amestris' birthday request, understood immediately what she intended to do and attempted to deflect her by offering her almost anything else she wanted: gold, cities, an army, whatever she asked, and Amestris refused every alternative and insisted on my sister's wife specifically, which tells you that this was not an act of jealous passion or impulsive violence, but a calculated political decision that Amestris had planned in advance, had waited months to execute, and was willing to confront her husband's explicit reluctance to accomplish, a level of deliberate premeditation that transforms what might otherwise look like a crime of passion into something considerably more disturbing. Macist Xerxes' brother, the husband of the woman who was mutilated, responded to finding his wife in the condition Amestris had created by immediately gathering his sons and setting out for Bactria, the distant eastern province where he served as governor, with the clear intention of using his military resources there to launch a rebellion against his brother. And what happened next illustrates something important about how power actually worked in the Achaemenid court. Xerxes, the man who had built the largest invasion force in ancient history and marched it across 2 continents, dispatched riders to intercept his brother before he reached Bactria, and had him killed on the road with all his sons, killing his own brother and nephews to prevent a rebellion that his wife's actions had directly caused. And somehow, in the ancient sources, the responsibility for this specific outcome attaches more firmly to Amestris than to the king who gave the order. Now here is where the story becomes something that no other YouTube channel covering Amestris has yet told, because every existing video on this subject stops at the mutilation and the death of Macist, treating that as the conclusion of her story, when in reality it was approximately the midpoint of her active political career, because Xerxes was assassinated in 465 BC by a conspiracy involving his own courtiers. And rather than receding from political life as widowed queens in the ancient world were typically expected to do, Amestris moved into the power vacuum her husband's death created, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been preparing for exactly this transition for years. The succession crisis that followed Xerxes' assassination was one of the bloodiest in Achaemenid history. His eldest son Darius was killed within days of the assassination. His second son, Artaxerxes, eventually secured the throne, and Amestris, who had successfully navigated the transition from queen to queen mother without losing a single measurable unit of political influence, immediately established herself as the dominant force in Artaxerxes' court, with ancient sources describing a situation in which the young king, who by all accounts was genuinely kind-hearted and deeply susceptible to his mother's influence, essentially outsourced the exercise of power to her for the first decade of his reign, creating a situation in which the most powerful person in the largest empire in the world was a widow in her 50s, who had been practicing the acquisition of power for 30 years and had run out of people willing to challenge her. The specific incident that best illustrates how Amestris exercised power during Artaxerxes' reign involves the general Megabyzus, one of the most decorated military commanders in Persian history, the man who had suppressed the Egyptian revolt that threatened to tear the empire apart, who had accepted the surrender of the Egyptian rebel leaders on his personal oath that their lives would be spared, brought them to the Persian court as prisoners, and then watched as Amestris, not Artaxerxes, ordered them extradited to her and executed, forcing Megabyzus to break his own oath to men who had surrendered specifically because of that oath, an act so politically aggressive and so personally insulting to one of the empire's most important military figures that it triggered a subsequent revolt by Megabyzus himself, which tells you that Amestris, even in her 60s, was still making decisions aggressive enough to destabilize the empire she was supposedly helping to maintain. Stay with this, because what comes next is the act that Herodotus recorded with the specific quality of discomfort that belongs to a historian confronting something he cannot quite categorize, and it requires one additional piece of context to fully understand, namely the Persian religious tradition of the subterranean god, a deity associated with the earth and the underworld who required periodic propitiation, whose worship involved gifts and sacrifices pressed into the ground, and whose specific requirements for the kind of sacrifice that would purchase the extension of a human life were, in the religious understanding of the Persian elite of 5th century BC, considered both legitimate and obligatory by anyone wealthy and powerful enough to afford the price. When Amestris reached old age, the ancient sources do not give us a precise date, but she appears to have been in her 70s or 80s. She ordered the burial of 14 living children of prominent Persian noble families as a sacrifice to the subterranean god, pressing them into the earth in exchange for what the religious logic of the time would have understood as a petition for extended life. And what makes this act so extraordinary in the historical record is the combination of three elements that rarely appear together. The victims were children of the highest-ranking families in the empire. The act was carried out not in secret, but apparently with sufficient openness that Herodotus was able to learn about it and record it. And nobody, not Xerxes, not the noble families whose children were taken, not the Persian court that had watched Amestris exercise unchecked power for 4 decades, appears to have been in a position to stop her. Here is the question that historians have been unable to fully answer for 2,000 years, and it is worth sitting with this, because the inability to answer it is itself the most revealing thing about Amestris' position in the Achaemenid court. Did the families of those 14 children consent, or were they simply unable to refuse? And the distinction between these two possibilities matters enormously, because if they consented, it tells you something about the religious culture of 5th century Persia that completely changes how we understand the act. And if they were unable to refuse, it tells you something about Amestris' power that makes everything else she did look like a warm-up. Because a woman who can take 14 children from 14 of the most powerful families in the world's largest empire and meet no resistance from any of them is not merely powerful. She is in a category of authority that has no adequate modern equivalent. The ancient sources that record the burial of the 14 children are not unanimous in their interpretation. Herodotus, who is the primary source, presents it as a religious act performed by Amestris in exchange for her own survival, while later sources approach it with varying degrees of credulity and horror. And modern historians have debated whether the account is accurate, exaggerated, or a piece of Greek anti-Persian propaganda designed to confirm the barbarian cruelty that Greek audiences expected from their Eastern enemies. But what every serious historian who has engaged with the question has ultimately concluded is that the act, whether reported with complete accuracy or not, is entirely consistent with what we know about Amestris from every other source, and that a woman who had demonstrated the specific capabilities and the specific willingness to use them that Amestris had demonstrated across 6 decades of Persian court life was fully capable of this specific act and several worse ones. Now here is the detail that absolutely nobody covering Amestris ever mentions, and this is the one that will make you stop and reconsider everything you thought you knew about who the most powerful people in the ancient world actually were. Amestris did not merely survive Xerxes and control Artaxerxes, she outlived almost everyone who had ever been a significant figure in her political life, dying in approximately 424 BC, at an age that ancient sources suggest was close to 90 years old, which means she lived through the reigns of Darius I, Xerxes I, and Artaxerxes I, witnessed the Persian Wars, the Greek Golden Age, the height and beginning of the decline of the Achaemenid Empire, and was still a functioning political force, still capable of ordering executions and controlling the behaviour of kings. In the same decade that Socrates was teaching philosophy in Athens, a lifespan so extraordinary and so filled with consequential action that it makes almost every other figure in the ancient world look like a brief footnote by comparison. The Greek historians who recorded Amestris' career, Herodotus primarily, but also Ctesias, whose account is more fragmentary and less reliable, wrote about her from a specific cultural position that shaped how they framed everything she did. Because in the Greek historical tradition, powerful women who exercised authority in the manner Amestris exercised, it were almost by definition evidence of the degeneracy of the political systems that allowed them to do so, which means that the Greek sources systematically interpreted Amestris' power as a sign of Xerxes' weakness, rather than as evidence of her own exceptional capabilities, calling her a jealous wife, a cruel despot, a woman who made the king a slave of his women. Framing that tells you considerably more about Greek attitudes toward female political agency than it tells you about Amestris herself. The specific religious framework within which the burial of the 14 children made sense to Amestris, and to the Persian elite who witnessed it without apparent protest, was Zoroastrianism, or at least a specific variant of Persian religious practice that existed in the Achaemenid court, which combined official Zoroastrian theology with older traditions of sacrifice and propitiation that Zoroastrianism in its orthodox form was supposed to have superseded, and the tension between these two religious frameworks, between the official state religion that prohibited human sacrifice and the older traditions that apparently permitted it, under specific circumstances, is one of the most revealing windows into the actual religious practice of the Persian royal court, as opposed to the official religious position that the Achaemenid kings advertised in their inscriptions. What happened to the families of the 14 children after the burial is not recorded in any source that has survived, and the silence of the ancient record on this specific point is itself historically significant, because in a court where the humiliation of powerful families was regularly documented and where the political consequences of perceived insults to noble houses were tracked with considerable care, the complete absence of any recorded response from the families whose children were taken tells you either that they genuinely consented and considered themselves honoured by the sacrifice, or that the power differential between Amestris and even the highest-ranking families in the empire was so complete that no response was possible. And either interpretation produces a picture of the Achaemenid court that is more extreme than almost anything recorded in the Greek or Roman sources about the Persian world. Artaxerxes I, the king whose reign Amestris dominated for decades, the man ancient sources describe as genuinely kind-hearted and heavily influenced by his mother, died in 424 BC within a few months of Amestris herself, and the succession crisis that followed his death illustrates with brutal clarity what Amestris's lifetime of power building had and had not accomplished, because without her presence to manage the competing claims of Artaxerxes' many sons by different mothers, the Achaemenid succession immediately collapsed into the exact kind of fratricidal violence that she had spent 60 years preventing 3 kings in a single year, multiple assassinations, the throne eventually secured by a man whose claim was weak enough that his reign would be defined by the instability Amestris's death had helped create, suggesting that she had not merely been exercising power for her own benefit, but had been, in the most literal possible sense, the structural element holding the Persian Empire together. The comparison between Amestris and the women who came after her in the Achaemenid dynasty, and here is the hook that should make every viewer of this video immediately want to watch the next one, is one of the most disturbing sequences of political escalation in ancient history, because Amestris, for all the extremity of what she did, was followed by a woman named Parysatis, who poisoned her own daughter-in-law by coating one side of a knife with poison and cutting meat with it at a shared meal, so that only her daughter-in-law's portion was contaminated, who had the tongue of a rival cut out while the person was still alive, and who controlled the Persian Empire through 2 more kings with a level of political sophistication that made even Amestris look, by comparison, almost restrained. The historical record of Amestris assembled from Herodotus' Histories, the fragments of Ctesias, the administrative records of the Persepolis fortification tablets, which name her and track her movements and rations, and the later Persian and Greek sources that attempted to reconcile the various accounts, presents a figure who is simultaneously more human and more extreme than the cartoon of a jealous queen that popular history has made of her, a woman whose political intelligence was genuinely extraordinary, whose understanding of how power worked in the specific environment she inhabited was arguably unmatched by anyone in the Achaemenid court of her era, and whose willingness to exercise that power without the constraints that limited most of the men around her was not a sign of madness or irrationality, but of a completely coherent and consistently applied political philosophy, that in a world where power was the only currency that mattered, the only rational response to having it was to use it, and the only rational response to not having enough of it was to take more. The Persepolis fortification tablets, clay administrative documents discovered in the ruins of Xerxes' palace complex at Persepolis in the 1930s, and only partially translated since then, representing one of the most significant primary source archives for Achaemenid Persian history ever found, contain references to Amestris that are entirely mundane. Her rations, her travel authorizations, the administrative records of her household, the movement of goods and personnel connected to her establishment, and the contrast between the clinical, administrative language of these records and the extreme acts documented in the literary sources creates one of the most haunting gaps in ancient historical research, because the clay tablets show you the bureaucratic machinery of a court functioning normally, while the literary sources show you what that court's most powerful figure was doing with the authority that bureaucratic machinery gave her. what Amestris represents in the history of the ancient world, and this is the conclusion that every historian who has studied her seriously has eventually reached. Even those who approach the Greek sources with the most skepticism is not an anomaly or an aberration, but a product, the specific product of a specific political system that concentrated absolute power in a single family and then provided no mechanism for limiting how that power was exercised by the women of that family who were intelligent enough and ruthless enough to accumulate it, which means that Amestris is not the story of one exceptional woman doing exceptional things, but the story of what a particular kind of political environment produces when someone with her specific capabilities is placed inside it and given 60 years to work. And the reason that story matters is that the political environments that produce Amestris are not unique to ancient Persia, but are a recurring feature of human political organisation, wherever power is absolute and accountability is absent. Amestris died in approximately 424 BC, having outlived her husband, having controlled his successor, having buried 14 living children in the earth, having mutilated a woman so completely that the ancient sources struggle to find adequate language for it, having broken the oath of one of the empire's greatest generals, having ordered executions that kings could not prevent, and having survived every enemy, every rival, and every political crisis that the most dangerous court in the ancient world could produce across 6 decades of continuous operation, and what Herodotus wrote about her at the end of his account, with a specific compression of a man who has run out of ways to adequately characterize what he has described was simply that she was cruel, as if the single word applied to everything the 9 books of his histories had shown about her was the only one that remained when all the specific acts had been recorded and all the context had been provided and all the historical analysis had been exhausted, and the fact that it feels both completely accurate and wholly inadequate simultaneously is perhaps the most honest thing that has ever been written about Amestris of Persia. And if that final compression, the most powerful woman in the ancient world, reduced at the end of her life to a single Greek adjective that cannot contain her, if that is the kind of history that makes you stop and think about what power actually costs and what it produces and what it leaves behind, then you already know what this channel is for, and you already know there are more stories like this one waiting women more extreme than Amestris, courts more dangerous than the Achaemenid palace, moments in history where the distance between civilization and its opposite was crossed so quietly and so completely that nobody noticed until the historian wrote it down. And those are the stories we tell here, in full, without softening and without looking away.